There was a table in the back corner of the finest restaurant in New Orleans that no one was allowed to approach, because the man who sat at it alone every Thursday had once let his own cousin sit down without an invitation, and the cousin was never seen again. The waitresses drew straws to see who'd have to refill his water, and then one rainy Thursday in the wet heart of the year, the newest girl on the floor, the big one, the quiet one, the one nobody looked at twice, walked straight across the room, pulled out the chair across from the most feared man in the city and sat down. The room stopped breathing. He set down his glass. "You have," Damiano Vitale said very quietly, "about 10 seconds to explain why you're still alive." And Nora Bennett said, "Because in about 10 minutes, 3 of Cesare Bruno's men are going to try to kill you in the alley, and I'm the only person in this room who came to warn you." The rain came down on the French Quarter that night, the way it does in the deep of the wet season. Warm, relentless drumming on the wrought iron and running in sheets off the galleries, turning Royal Street into a black mirror that swallowed the gaslight whole. Colette sat on a corner where the money went to be seen. White tablecloths, oysters flown in on ice, a wine list thick as a hymnal, and a clientele that ran the city from the good tables. Judges, developers, the men who owned things. Nora Bennett had waited that floor for 4 months, and in 4 months she had become part of the furniture, which in her experience was the natural condition of a woman built like her. She refilled the water and cleared the plates and recited the specials and watched the powerful of New Orleans forget she had ears the second she stopped talking. She was 33. She wore a size 22 in a black uniform that the restaurant had ordered a size too small on purpose to punish her for taking up more of the world than they thought she was entitled to. And she had learned to carry it the way she learned to carry everything. Quietly and with a straight back and a plan she told no one. Because Nora hadn't taken this job for the tips. She'd taken it because both of them ate here. The man she was going to destroy, and the only man alive who could help her do it. Cesare Bruno's people held the center of the room on the loud nights, and Cesare himself came for the late supper on Fridays, an old careful man in a beautiful suit, gracious to the staff, generous with the busboys, beloved by a city that had decided to remember him as a patron of the arts and forget that he'd built his fortune the way rot builds, quietly, in the dark at someone else's expense. 12 years ago, the someone else had been Thomas Bennett. Her father had owned the best restaurant on Royal Street. Bennett's, a New Orleans institution. 3 generations of Sunday suppers and second lines and a gumbo people drove from Baton Rouge for. Cesare Bruno had been buying up the block to move dirty money through clean kitchens, and Thomas Bennett wouldn't sell. So first, the health inspector came and found violations that weren't there. And then the liquor board pulled a license over a technicality no one else was ever cited for. And then a supplier Thomas had used for 20 years suddenly demanded cash up front, and then the bank, and then the auction. Bruno bought Bennett's for a song and reopened it 8 months later under a new name with the same recipes and none of the family. And Thomas Bennett died the next winter of a stroke his doctor called the kind grief brings on. He left a widow whose own health was failing. A son the Bruno crews were already circling with the family's manufactured debt, and a daughter who now carried plates for strangers 3 blocks from the restaurant her great-grandfather built. Nora had spent 12 years knowing exactly who did it, and exactly how little that knowledge was worth, which was nothing at all. You cannot indict a patron of the arts. Cesare Bruno owned half the quarter, a block of the city council, and a wing of the children's hospital. He'd sent a white spray of lilies to Thomas Bennett's funeral. Nora had watched her mother thank him for them, and then 4 months ago, a new man had started keeping a Thursday table at Colette's, and the whole staff had gone quiet the first time he walked in. And Nora had heard his name whispered like a warning against weather, and she had begun slowly to form the most dangerous idea of her life. "Please, tell me you're not doing what your face says you're doing," murmured Grace Molina, catching her by the wine station. Grace had been at Colette's for years and had taken Nora under her wing on the first shift, the way she took in strays. "You've got that look. The one from the night you told me about your daddy." "I'm working," Nora said. "You staring at the corner table. Nobody stares at the corner table chair. People have stopped existing for less. The corner table. Every Thursday, Damiano Vitali, alone, with a bottle of something old and a book he actually read, and an emptiness of 6 feet around him that no one on the staff or in the city would dream of crossing. They said he'd made his name young and made it in blood. They said he only ever had to prove it a handful of times, which was the whole point. You don't need to burn a city down twice if the first fire is remembered right. They said he'd let his cousin sit at that table uninvited once years ago, and the cousin had insulted him, and the cousin was a story now, a thing men told in parking garages to explain why you kept your distance. Nora had spent 4 months serving that table and being invisible at it, refilling the water, clearing the course, fading back, and in 4 months of being furniture she had learned that Damiano Vitale was the only person in New Orleans who genuinely structurally hated Cesare Bruno, because Bruno had spent 2 years creeping into Vitale territory the slow, polite, patient way water gets into a boat. Her enemy's enemy ate here every Thursday. All she had to do was find the nerve to sit down. She found it on a Thursday in July, and she found it because of the men at table 11. They were Bruno's. She knew them by now, knew their usual, knew the one who snapped his fingers and the one who never tipped, and they were drunk and low and talking. And Nora was clearing the empty two-top beside them, invisible as ever, when she heard the word alley, and then the word Vital, and then, mistakably, a time. 11 o'clock, when the rain was heaviest and the quarter emptiest, and a man leaving through the kitchen door into the back alley, the way Damiano Vitale always left, would be alone. 3 of them. The alley. 11. Nora straightened up slowly with a tray of dirty glasses and a decision already made, because some decisions make themselves and only tell you afterward. She could warn a manager who worked for the building's owner, who was one of Bruno's shells. She could call the police who would arrive after. She could keep her head down and let the most feared man in the city walk into a trap at 11 and mourn, quietly, the only real chance she'd ever have at Cesare Bruno. Or she could do the thing no one in New Orleans had done in years. She set the tray down. She crossed the room, past Grace's white face, past the maître de half rising in horror, straight to the corner table, and she pulled out the chair across from Damiano Vitale and sat down in it uninvited, and folded her hands on the white cloth to keep them from shaking. He looked up from his book with an expression of mild, terrible curiosity. He set down his glass. "You have," he said, very quietly, "about 10 seconds to explain why you're still alive." "Because in about 10 minutes, Nora said, 3 of Cesare Bruno's men are going to try to kill you in the alley behind this kitchen. At 11, when you leave the way you always leave. I heard them at table 11, and I'm the only person in this room who crossed it to tell you." She held his eyes, though every cell in her body was screaming to look away. "You can spend the last of my 10 seconds deciding whether I'm lying." "I wouldn't. It's raining, and they're drunk, and they think you're a habit." For a long moment, the most dangerous man in the city looked at the waitress who had sat down at his table, and the whole restaurant held its breath around them, and the rain came down on the iron. Then Damiano Vitale did something no one at Colette's had ever seen. He smiled, just barely, just at the corner of his mouth, and he lifted one finger, and Enzo Marchetti materialized from the bar where he'd been all along, and Damiano said, without looking away from Nora, 3 men, the kitchen alley. 11. Go and be disappointing to them. Enzo went. "Now," Damiano said, and gestured almost graciously at the chair she was already in. "Since you've taken the seat, nobody sits at this table. You should tell me why you decided to be the exception. And you should make it interesting, because you've just made yourself the most interesting thing that's happened to me in a year, and I'd hate to be wrong about you." So she told him. Not all of it that first night, but enough. Her name, her father, Bennett's on Royal Street, and the health inspector, and the license, and the lilies, and Damiano Vitale listened to all of it without moving, the book forgotten. And when she was done, he was quiet for a while, turning his glass a slow quarter turn on the cloth. "You didn't sit down to warn me out of the goodness of your heart," he said finally. "You could have sent a note. You sat down so I'd see your face when you did it, so I'd owe it to a person, not a rumor. Something like respect moved behind his eyes. "You've been serving me water for 4 months and planning this the whole time. You're the only man in this city who hates him as much as I do," Nora said. "I've spent 12 years with no way to reach Cesare Bruno, and every Thursday the way to reach him has been sitting in my section, tipping 20%, reading a book." She lifted her chin. "So here's what I actually want. Since we're past the water glasses, I don't want your money and I don't want your protection. I want a partner. You want Bruno gone. So do I. You got the reach. I've got 4 months of being invisible in the one room where he does his business, and a lifetime of knowing exactly how a restaurant like his really works. That's not a favor I'm asking. It's a deal I'm offering. And I already paid the deposit. Ask the 3 men in the alley." Damiano Vitale looked at her for a long, long moment. "In 20 years, he said, no one has ever sat down at this table uninvited and lived, let alone talked me into a partnership before the entree." He refilled her water himself, which the whole staff would talk about for a year. "Partners, finish your shift. And then, Miss Bennett, we're going to have a very long conversation about restaurants." The dress came before the strategy, and she won it, which told her what kind of partnership this was going to be. A stylist named Fabian Cross arrived to make her appropriate for the rooms she'd now be moving through, and he circled her twice with pursed lips before pulling long, dark, shapeless things off the rack, murmuring about drawing the eye up and away, about the mercy of a vertical line, about how with her figure the entire art was minimizing. "We hide the waist, we go long, we don't let the eye stop anywhere it shouldn't," he explained, kindly, holding a black column against her like a sentence handed down. "You're dressing her to apologize for existing." Damiano had come in without a sound and pushed the rack aside with the flat of his hand, slow and final. "She sat down at a table that's killed men. She's not going to walk into these rooms disguised as a woman hoping not to be noticed. Out." Fabian laughed. Damiano turned. "What do you want to wear?" Nobody had asked her that since she was a girl in her father's dining room. She had to look at the floor for a moment. "Amethyst," she said. "Deep violet, the color of the sky over the river. The half hour before a storm. My father used to call that light the city holding its breath. Heavy silk, cut clean. Nothing that hides in itself. Bare arms." She lifted her chin. "I spent my whole life being told to fold up small so I'd fit in rooms that didn't want me. I'm done. Let them see alls of me. In my experience, a woman they can't stop looking at is a woman they forget to be careful around." Enzo, by the window, took his hands out of his pockets. She learned things about Damiano in the weeks that followed, in the odd hours the work threw them together. She learned the most feared man in New Orleans couldn't sleep and read late into the night in a leather chair. Always histories of the city, the fevers and the floods, the disasters that had come for everyone equally. She learned he'd been 14 when he watched his father die in the back of a restaurant, much like this one, over a debt, much like her brother's, and that he'd spent his whole life becoming the kind of man that never happens to. She learned he pressed his thumb to an old burn scar on the back of his hand when a thing reached him, and that he did it once, watching her cross a room, and blamed the humidity. "They talk about you like you're the weather," she said to him one night, both of them at the empty bar of a shuttered Vitale place at 2 in the morning. The ceiling fans turning slow, like a storm sitting off the coast. "Why?" "Because I built it that way, young. On purpose," he said. He turned his glass without drinking. "The men who last aren't the loud ones. Loud is just fear wearing a good suit. The men who last are the exact ones. You say a thing once, you mean the whole of it, and the room does the rest of the work for you out of its own imagination. It costs you almost nothing." He set the glass down. "It also turns you into a story until there's no man left underneath it, and then a waitress sits down at your table because she'd rather warn you than be safe, and you remember you used to be a person." It's careless of her. I keep meaning to mind. "Don't," Nora said. "No," he agreed almost to himself. "I don't suppose I will." The first strike was hers, and she never once let it be called anything else. Cesare Bruno's cleanest money moved through the thing nobody thinks to audit: liquor. He owned a distribution company that supplied every bar and restaurant he controlled, and the restaurants were billed 3 and 4 times the real price for spirits. Some watered, some never delivered at all. So that dirty cash walked out the front door dressed as an honest invoice for an honest case of bourbon. It was invisible. Nobody counts the bottles. But Nora had grown up behind a bar and spent 4 months working one, and she knew the way you know your own hands exactly how much liquor a room like Colette's actually pours in a night, and exactly what it should cost. They're billing Colette's for $1,100 of top shelf a week that never crosses the bar. She told Damiano and Enzo, spreading invoices she'd walked out of the manager's office in her apron, because who searches the waitress? I've poured this room 4 months. There's no way we move what these invoices say. Half these bottles are ghosts, and the other half are cut. Multiplied across 40 restaurants he supplies, and that's how the dirty money comes out clean. As bruised nobody drink. She looked up. You don't need a witness. You need a state liquor auditor, a subpoena for the distributor's delivery logs, and one reporter who likes a story about a beloved patron watering the whiskey. It's all there. Somebody just has to count the bottles. Enzo looked at Damiano. Damiano looked at the invoices for a long, long time. I've kept accountants for 20 years, he said quietly, who never found me a cleaner cut than the waitress who counts the pours. Enzo, she found the seam in an apron. She did it herself, because that was the deal, always. She walked into the State Alcohol Board's office in deep amethyst with her spine like a plumb line and filed a complaint under her own name. And afterward she stood at a bar beside a reporter who liked bringing down beloved men and said quietly, "Ask Bruno's distributor to produce 1 case of the Thursday order. Just 1. Watch how fast a patron of the arts stops returning calls." 3 weeks later, the story ran. The audit opened. The distributor's accounts froze, and $90 million of Cesare Bruno's laundry stopped moving and had to surface in the open in daylight, where a careful old man was forced at last to reach for it with his own bare hand. They came for her on a Sunday, in the empty restaurant after close, because that was the 1 hour she was ever alone. She felt it before she understood it. A wrongness in a room she now knew better than her own apartment. There was a man by the swinging kitchen door who had no reason to be there, still in the way that living men are never still, his hands loose and empty and ready. Later, Enzo would tell her his name was Cain, and that he'd done this 11 times and buried 11 people and never once been seen leaving. He wasn't there for Nora. He was there because at 11 Damiano was coming to walk her home through the rain, alone, the way he'd started to. Alone, because the only man who knew he'd be there without his crew was Renzo Fontana. Cain's hand drifted toward the small of his back, and there was no time to scream, so Nora did the only thing a woman who'd worked a floor for 4 months knew how to do fast. The coffee service was right beside her. The big silver urn kept scalding for the late tables, and she wrenched the spout open and threw an arc of it straight into his face. And while he was blind and roaring, she took a magnum of wine off the service shelf by the neck two-handed and swung it like she was breaking ground. 12 years of hoisting kegs in her father's cellar, as a girl 4 months of hauling bus tubs up narrow stairs. She had strength no one at Colette's had ever bothered to imagine, because they'd never once looked at her arms and thought anything but soft. The bottle did what a full magnum does. He went down. Damiano came through the front door into a nightmare. A man on the floor and Nora standing over him. Amethyst gone dark down the front, breathing hard and terribly, perfectly steady, the broken bottle still in her fist. She'd chosen this. She did not look away from what she'd done, because looking away would have made it a thing that happened to her. And she was finished, forever, with the first kind. What happened to Cain in the next minute was fast and quiet and final, and she watched all of it, because she'd walked into this world with clear eyes and would not start closing them now. Then Damiano's hands were on her face and they were shaking. The storm off the coast, the man the whole city feared. His hands going like a boy's, checking her arms, her throat, saying her name low once. The way you say a thing. To be sure, the floor still holds. He wasn't sent for me, Nora got out. Damiano. He was waiting for you. And only 3 people knew you'd be here alone tonight. I know. It's Renzo. I know. His forehead dropped to hers, and he shut his eyes. I've known for a week. I needed him to reach so I'd have him queen, and I let him reach, and he reached at you, and his voice fractured. All the exactness gone out of it at once. I set myself out as bait, and he threw a knife at the one person in this world He stopped. Tell me to stop. Right now. And I'll put you and your family somewhere he can never reach, and you'll never have to see me again. Nora took 2 fistfuls of his rain-soaked collar and pulled him down and kissed him. It was not gentle, and it was not a beginning. It was a woman taking a thing the whole world had spent 33 years insisting she had no permission to want, and his hand came up into her hair and he made a low broken sound against her mouth, like a man setting down a weight so old he'd forgotten it had ends. No, she said against his lips. We finish it. Together. And you stop deciding what I'm allowed to walk into. That part's over. She pulled back to look at him. I sat down at your table on purpose. I knew what the chair might cost. I'll finish what I sat down to start, standing up next to you. That's the deal I chose. Yes, he said. Wrecked. God help every one of them. Yes. The reckoning came for Cesare Bruno on a gray afternoon in a back room above an oyster house on Decatur that he kept because he was 70 and believed the old rooms were the safe ones, and they had been, right up to the hour they weren't. Renzo Fontana was already in the chair when Nora walked in beside Damiano. He'd been there a while. He was still hunting for the easy smile that had carried him through 8 years of Sunday suppers, and it was nowhere to be found. Boss, he said, Damiano, whatever she played you, you've been Bruno's man in my house for a decade, Damiano said in the flat, even voice he'd used to send back a cold plate. You gave him our territory and our roots. And 12 years ago, before you were ever mine, you're the one who told Cesare that Thomas Bennett's restaurant was right for the taking. He nodded, slow. You brought my mother pralines last Christmas. From the place on Chartres, she keeps the tin on the shelf. He nodded again. The pralines are the part I keep turning over. The tin on the shelf. Renzo stopped looking for the smile. Nora set a folder on the desk and opened it herself. Then she did the thing she'd spent 33 years being told her body had no right to do. She sat uninvited again on the edge of that desk, took up exactly as much room as she pleased, and looked a 70-year-old killer in the eye, until he had no choice but to look back at the waitress he'd let refill his water for months. You served the city gumbo out of my father's kitchen for 12 years and called it your own, she said. You sent lilies to his funeral and let my mother thank you for them. Did you know she thanked you? She did. She has manners you'll never understand. She turned a page. Every clean dollar you've laundered through that distributor froze the week the auditor started counting bottles, because a waitress knew what a room actually pours. Renzo signed his cooperation this morning. I have him on tape from a rainy Thursday, selling you to save himself. And the health inspector who lied about my father's kitchen 12 years ago retired rich and scared, and this week he decided he'd rather talk than fall with you. She looked up. You gave Renzo 20 years, and he sold you in a phone call. You built a whole life out of people who will leave the instant the tide turns. And the tide turned, Cesare, the night a waitress you never once looked at sat down at the wrong table. Cesare Bruno looked at Renzo. Renzo looked at the floor, and Nora Bennett watched a careful old man understand in real time that his entire world had been quietly taken apart by the 2 people he'd been far too important to see. A rival he'd underestimated, and a waitress he'd never looked at all. You want me on my knees, Cesare said. No, Nora said. I want you awake, all the way through it. My father got a stroke and a rented room and a spray of your lilies. I just want you awake and watching and understanding at the very end that a woman who carried your plates carried you out too. Salvatore Conti. The old consigliere who'd advised the Vitale family 40 years and had doubted the waitress twice in the beginning, rose slowly from the chair in the corner where he'd watched it all and said nothing. And the standing itself was the whole blessing. The indictment ran to 20 counts. The distributor collapsed the restaurants Bruno controlled, went into receivership, and Nora bought back exactly one thing at the auction for cash quietly. Not the building. The building was a grave. But the old carved sign that had hung over the door of Bennett's on Royal Street, the one Bruno had taken down and crated and never had the heart to burn. She hung it in her mother's kitchen. Renzo Fontana took his deal in his 11 years, and a name no one in that city will say aloud at a table again. Gerald Thorne, tangled in the same paperwork, went from Bruno's floor manager to a witness to nothing. Camilla Ashford married a title in Havana and stopped returning New Orleans calls, which is what New Orleans does instead of a verdict. Sammy Bennett's debt evaporated with the shell that held it. Margaret Bennett got the surgery she needed that autumn and cried and told the whole ward that her daughter had always been the strong one. The family had just been too busy grieving to notice. Nora and Damiano married in the spring, in a courtyard off Royal Street, 3 doors from where Bennett's used to be. She wore amethyst. Everyone understood. And when the man the whole city feared said his vows in that even voice that never once had to rise, he promised to be exact about her every day he was breathing. And half the hard men in the courtyard went still, because they knew precisely what exact meant when he said it. And they understood that the waitress in violet was no longer anyone in New Orleans could afford to seat in the back. For 4 months they let her pour their water and clear their plates and stand close enough to hear anything, because they were certain a woman built like her, quiet like her, was nothing but a pair of hands. That's the flaw in the person you decide doesn't count. You say the dangerous thing right in front of her, because you've decided she isn't really in the room. And she hears all of it. And one rainy night, she stops being furniture and pulls out a chair. So be careful whose water you let a stranger refill. She may be deciding, one Thursday at a time, exactly where to sit when it's finally her turn at the table. If her reckoning gave you chills, hit that like button. Share this with someone who's done watching heroines wait to be saved. And subscribe for the next story. Then, tell me down in the comments, who should she come for next?